Good day, everyone who's attending. You are at the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiencies IRRP capacity building session focused on data collection done in partnership with our good friends at USAID and NREL, as well as our usual sponsors, the GIZ. Hope you're in the right place. We'll be beginning in just about a minute. So we have 5 attendees so far. No doubt that will fill up as we go.
Hello, Jerry. Sorry, Jerry, you muted again.
Thank you for that, James. Am I talking off my head with my button muted? So it goes. Welcome, everybody, to our Data Collection to Support Resilience Planning webinar. My name is Gerald Lindo. I am with the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. And I'd want to thank you all for attending with us today. Now, what's this event all about? Well, to give you a bit of background, at the 82nd special meeting for the Council for Trade and Economic Development, the CARICOM organ, CARICOM endorsed a certain methodology for how energy planning should be done within the region. This is integrated resource and resilience planning. It takes the traditional approach to energy planning that we've used in the region and it adds layers of climate resilience and disaster resilience to that planning process. So it's more wholesome, more holistic, and so it can give a better result for us in the region. It was recognized, however, that to take this new approach, it would require a lot of capacity building. And so the CCREEE has set up a series of capacity building events, such as this one, to further the cause of integrated resource and resilience planning throughout the region. This particular event is focused on data collection. You can't really plan without good data. And as we know, as I'm sure you know, you, our audience, sometimes getting to the data can be a bit difficult. So today we're going to speak a bit about what the data requirements are for good IRRP planning, how you can overcome some of the issues and hiccups that you might find in data collection and data aggregation, and also how to know that you're collecting things of good quality on a good and repeating basis. Once again, our sponsors for today and our main collaborators for this event will be the National Renewable Energy Laboratory out of the USA, with the support of the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. Just as a matter of logistics, because we do expect a lot of people today, your microphones have been muted, so sorry we won't be able to speak to you directly. However, you should all see a Q&A box on your screens. If you enter your questions and comments there, we'll be sure to get to them as we go. Let me start now by introducing the speakers for today. And if you could advance to the next slide there, please, James. There we go. As said, I'm Gerald Lindo. I am the moderator. I am the Renewable Energy Unit Lead at the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. And we have a wide bunch of speakers for you today to give us a lot of varying sorts of information. We have way down in the bottom there, James Elworth. He's going to be leading off for NREL. He's a research engineer there. And the rest of the NREL team is rounded out by Nate Blair, who's a distributed systems and storage analyst. We have Gail Mosey, who is a senior researcher at NREL, and we have Sertaj Akar, who is our systems engineer also at NREL. We'll also be getting the perspectives of Juanita Heidel, who's a senior vice president of ICF. She did integrated resource planning work in Tanzania and a bit in Ghana as well. So she's going to share some of the practical experience from that to give us some extra insights. But our next speaker is an old friend. He is from USAID. He's Eric Conde, who's the project management specialist based in the DR. And he's going to give us a few words to kick us off. So over to you, please, Eric.
Thank you, Jerry, and hello, everyone. It's glad to be part of this event. Let me project this slide. Hopefully you can see it okay. So on behalf of the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, I welcome you to this important webinar on data collection process for the increasing capacities in the Caribbean region for developing integrated resource and resilience planning, or IRRP as we call them. This level of regional support and coordination is at the center of USAID's Caribbean Energy Initiative, as we call it. And this is our current project for improving resiliency in the Caribbean region. Given the critical role that electricity sectors play in daily welfare, advancing economic growth in the region and post-disaster recovery, CEI focuses on helping energy systems across the region to become more resilient. This project was launched back in the mid-2019 out of the Dominican Republic mission for USAID and is aiming to support the efforts in the region to advance policy reform, enable economic benefits, and preserve the development of resilience in the face of natural disasters, extreme weather, and market shocks impacts. Currently, at this stage, we are designing our implementing activities through which CI objectives will be pursued, and hopefully we'll be able to start that on the ground later in the year. So we're looking forward to that component. Regarding today's session, I can add that this one is a key element under the IRRP webinar series that the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, has jointly designed with USAID, and CCREEE has been taking this task of coordinating us, that with also support from the GIZ. I can add that the USAID and NREL partnership was created to deliver clean, reliable, and affordable energy to the developing world, and it's become a great resource to have available to facilitate our work in the Caribbean region. This support and technical system is materialized through a variety of platforms and technical tools, some of which we see on the slides. And these are available to overcome critical challenge in the that face the energy sector, such as the lack of sound planning capacities, the inclusion of resiliency lens, the design of solutions, and also the complexity of determining the feasibility for expanding newer and cleaner technology for energy generation. Finally, I want to acknowledge the broad level of participation we have with us today, and I'm also sure that we'll continue to collaborate to advance our national and regional goals for increasing resilience in energy sectors in the region. And for this, I do encourage you to keep in mind support available through USAID and also through Emerald platforms, particularly the Resilience Energy platform, which is fully available online. And please also, I encourage you to continue to join this webinar series, as it's critical for planning and achieving that resilience in our region. So I'm pretty sure that we'll have a great exchange today. We have a good set of key speakers. And thank you all for listening. Back to you, Jerry.
All right, I guess I'll take it from here. Or thank you. Yeah, thanks, Eric. Thank you for that introduction and thanks for those words. This is James Ellsworth from the National Renewable Energy Lab here, and I'll just get things started and kicked off with a couple of intro polling questions. Mostly, I posted the link that you can click on to get to the poll questions in the Q&A for this meeting, and I'll share the polls right here. So if you go to the Q&A of the meeting and click on that poll link, it is www.pollev.com/LCROW118 if you want to type that in manually. But we'll start this off with some background. This is always fun seeing where we have attendees from on these meetings. Which country do you or does your organization represent? And we've got a list here based on past attendees of these webinars, so not picking favorites, just putting up where we've seen the most attendees from the past in mostly alphabetical order right here. I wonder if we're having, okay, we're getting some people logged on. That's good. That's a good sign. I'll be taking a while, but again, the link is in the Q&A. It's up at the top of the screen here too, pollev.com/LCROW118. And if you have other, there's an option at the bottom for other if your country is not on here. And if you are from a different country, please go back to the Teams live event and type that into the chat. And we'll just give this one a couple extra seconds to get people, to allow people some time to shift over to this platform and respond. Whole list of countries, it sounds like places I'd like to be right now in the middle of the winter here in Colorado. All right, a couple more results trickling in. We've got Barbados, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Trinidad, Tobago, and the US all represented. All right, hopefully people are still getting over to the forum, but we'll go to the next question. We'll go to the next question. For now, another background question. What type of organization or agency do you represent? We've had a lot of utility and energy agency representatives in the past. But if you're a regulator from an environmental group, academia, if you're here from USAID or somewhere else, and I have to activate this question. There we go. Now you should be able to see it. So just a little background on who our audience is, so our speakers can speak to this audience and tailor their talks towards you guys a bit better. And again, if you're just joining, I posted a link to join this this live polling in the question and answer section of the Teams live event. So please just click on that, and that should send you directly over to this polling platform. All right. If you're having any difficulties getting over to this platform too, please feel free to type that in the Q&A and we'll try to help you out. All right, well, we'll go to the next question then. Start a couple questions specifically on data here to kind of get your thoughts simmering on the topic that we're going to get into today. So in general, this is in general what your thoughts are. How important is the collection of reliable energy sector data for energy planning? Is it essential, very important, somewhat important, or not important? Looks like a 2/3, 1/3 split right now. Either essential or very important. Shifting a little more towards essential, that's good. You've all tuned into this webinar, so hopefully you realize it's important, but we'll focus on, that'll be the topic we'll focus on today. You know, what data you need, why it's important, and then actually how to acquire that data. All right, we'll hop on over to the next question. Personally, taking a look at this now rather than overall as a whole, how important is the collection of reliable energy sector data to your work individually? So not as a whole, but individually, how important is getting reliable energy sector data? I think that word reliable is probably key there and pretty important. This might depend on your role. Maybe you're more involved in this or not, so I'd expect to see maybe a slightly different response here than the last question. It looks pretty similar, still either essential or very important, I'd say. All right, next question here. Give this a little time to load. So for you, how easy is it to get data from stakeholder agencies in the energy sector? So is this something that you found easy or found very easy, easy, hard, or very hard? I think this is one of the motivating factors for this session today, that sometimes it is difficult to get the data that is really essential to inform those effective long-term power sector planning processes. Most people agreeing it is hard, looks like. All right, I think we have 2 more questions to get through here. How frequently do you need access to data from other agencies or entities in the energy sector? So in your role, how often is it that you are looking to acquire this data from other agencies? Is it daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, or annually? And I've got to activate it. Now we should start seeing some responses coming in. A couple of votes for weekly, quarterly, monthly. And I'll just say again, if you are just hopping in and joining this late, we're doing some live polling here, and I've put a link to this live poll in the Q&A pane on the Teams live meeting. The link is also on the top of the page you're seeing on the screen here. And we'll just do one last question. And this last question really gets at the pain points, and we'll right here. Oops. Here we go. The pain points and like the difficulties that you have in actually getting data. And it's small text. If you can't see it, I'll read it out. But what are the biggest challenges you face when fulfilling data requests? So getting at the difficulties in getting data here. Choice A says we have insufficient staff time to dedicate to collection or participation or preparation, sorry. Choice B is data is not in a digital format. Choice C is data is digital, but it's hard to find. Choice D is data is digital, but hard to retrieve. Maybe it's in separate documents, geographical locations, or in legacy systems. E is that data is digital and accessible, but it's in the wrong format for the request. F is that our data is confidential, but we rarely share it. G might be cybersecurity concerns over sharing data. And then H is other. And if you do have an other response, please post that to the Q&A. All right, looks like we're finally getting some people trickling in and responding to these to this question. Figured out the software. But a good split here. Looks like the leader is our data is confidential and we rarely share it. and maybe that's because of cybersecurity concerns in G, but also some issues with data not being in a digital format. All right, so thank you all for responding to that. There's a couple more responses trickle in here, but with that, we'll kick it off, and I will send it over to our first presenter, who is my colleague, Nate Blair from the National Renewable Energy Lab.
Thank you, James. That's really helpful. And let me just get my slides up here and make sure we're in full screen mode. And then share those slides. Hopefully everyone can see these. I'm excited to be here today. It's also nice to think about warm, sunny places when it's snowing outside. So that's great. I'm excited to be here. I think my goal is to fairly quickly cover some large buckets of information about what kinds of data that we need, and perhaps to put a little bit of an NREL spin on some of the data that we think would be helpful that we provide, and also just and for things that that we don't have in our possession, perhaps some other resources to reach out to those. And then I added a few thoughts at the end about how this data flows into some of the modeling and other things that are needed. And I think that the next speakers will also continue to peel back the onion of what I'm talking about. So let me go to the first slide. So there's a number of different data pieces that we need. This is one. I wanted to start with this one because I'm super excited about it. It tells a great story for renewables, where they've been and where they're likely to go. And I think in the island countries, I was just talking with someone about islands off of India this morning, in the Maldives as well. Lots of interest in solar and lots of interest in batteries. And what's exciting for all the ratepayers is I think that we're going to see even cheaper options for these technologies as we go ahead. So from a integrated resource planning perspective, knowing one, what these costs are today, and then also understanding where these costs might go over the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. NREL is very brave and looks out to 2050. As we move out into the future, all of these cost numbers get to be less and less certain and more uncertain. But what you can see is that there's anticipation that costs will move to the future. I've pulled 3 graphs from what I call the NREL annual technology baseline costs, and these are costs kind of average for an average resource in the US. So obviously there's far windier places and less windy. And then there's also on top of that an anticipation that costs might fall a little bit, kind of an expected amount. And then, you know, with some breakthroughs or some real changes to the marketplace, the cost could fall even below that. And we compare these costs across a bunch of literature sources. So, so we're seeing that this is a normalized LCOE. So this is that cost by 2030 for wind in the moderate case would fall another 20% perhaps. For PV, you're going from about $1.4 per watt AC today, or maybe more like 1.6. It's a little confusing there at the beginning in 2020, and then by 2030 falling to more, quite a bit under $1 a watt, more like 90 cents. So that's a pretty significant drop. And then lastly, costs for this is a 4-hour battery capital cost. relative to 2019. If we're saying we're right here, we're looking by 2030 to be another 50% cheaper. And all of these are on top of some rather significant cost drops over the last 5 to 10 years. So I think this is a really important factor in the planning process, particularly if you're looking at trying to add more renewables, and how you stage that deployment is really important. So historical load data, I've added two kind of classical pieces with regards to renewables and load data. This is in California, where the load kind of goes, historically has gone up during the day and then peaked in the evening. And what we're seeing now is, as you have more and more solar on the grid in California, it's eating away at that daytime load, and you've got a bigger peak perhaps even in the evening. And so that's called the duck curve. There's plenty more to read about that online, but the point being that the load is, one, a function of the air conditioners, refrigerators, heating, cooling industry locally, as well as then whatever distributed generation or distributed electrification is happening on top of that. And so from my perspective, the planning of the grid, particularly for some of these areas, could be really more complex than it has been in the past. And I think that's an important piece to capture as well. We're looking at some really significant electric vehicle growth, and I think in islands where the diesel price is quite high, I think there's an expectation of some of that happening as well. And the real question is, when are these EVs going to be charging, and how does that impact both the peak load, the overall energy consumption, and the future? And that's an open question in the US. We just had a meeting yesterday about managed charging that I was a part of. So trying to get people to charge during the day or charge late at night and not during the peak period. So you don't have to add as much, you have to use more energy, but not maybe add as much peaking capacity. Obviously, industrial load growth will also be critical, and is a function of electrification, so increasing the load, but also distributed generation, such as rooftop PV. So all of these things come together to make a difficult planning process. But I think the important thing here is gathering up what the historical load has been, what that looks like on a typical day, a typical year, is all pretty critical to the planning. Transmission and distribution maps and data. I've got a couple examples here of a suburban area in the US in the upper right, Puerto Rico in the lower right, and then in the lower left, kind of a vision of the way things are now, where you have central stations feeding power out to the different homes, and then in the future there might be a mix of central generation, industry, storage, renewables, and then renewables and EVs and other things out at the end of the distribution line. And that has made things more difficult. But collecting what's already going on is for the grid integration studies that NREL has done, often collecting that grid data can be a huge part of the project. And gathering it and putting it into the format that these grid modeling tools can handle, if it's not already in that format, can be a really significant effort to digitize some of that data if it's not already available in a format that can be either used or translated easily. So that's a key part of any grid integration project. Fuel price forecasts. Here's another one where it's very difficult for the US mainland. We have a lot of fuel price forecast, fuel price data and fuel price forecasts. So the US EIA has the annual energy outlook. and you can see here that this is the world oil prices in 3 cases stemming from 2020. These are vastly different oil prices. So I think my takeaway from that and what I'm trying to impart to you all is that the future of oil prices is potentially highly varied. I think in the US, the rule of thumb is, hey, we've got low oil prices. If they start to go up, we're going to have more fracked oil and fracked natural gas, and that'll help keep the prices low for quite a while. But the global market for oil, the global market for natural gas is a different beast, and can really impact what those prices are going to be in the future. So setting up a few scenarios around different fuel prices in the future is going to be important. I also have a bullet here that fuel costs are impacted strongly by subsidies and delivery costs, particularly in island nations or remote systems. And so I think this is a difficult piece to capture in the planning process, but also really important. So one of the things we do at NREL that I think can be really helpful depending on your location, and I think if you have needs for wind data in particular, please reach out to us. I'm happy to talk about what might be available. One of our key products at NREL is something called the Wind Toolkit, and that has 7 years of hourly and sometimes sub-hourly data that you can download and use, both onshore and near offshore, as you can see in this graphic. It does cover some of the Caribbean, but not all of it. There has been some additional work. As you can see, this doesn't cover Puerto Rico, but there's been some additional wind resource development for Puerto Rico over the last few years in response to some of the difficulties they've been having as well. And then we have at the U.S. Department of Energy a website that includes a lot of wind maps and data, both national and international. And so if we zoom in a little bit, you can see the grid, the modeling works such that you set the boundaries of a grid, and then it generates the data using a lot of sources and a lot of complex modeling to generate the data within that. I tried to zoom in here to some of the countries and that boundary, so you can get an idea of what countries are maybe included and which countries are not included in the Wind Toolkit at the moment. There is active effort on trying to expand and extend the Wind Toolkit, and we'll pass that information on as soon as we have it. The other one that I think is really critical and definitely covers all of the countries on this call is the National Solar Radiation Database. This is a free data set covering all of most of North America and most of South America, and as you can see, way out into these island states here. We are working right now to expand the NSRDB into Southeast Asia and some other areas of the world as well. There are obviously lots of companies that are willing to create and generate solar resource data for you, not for free, however, and that's more typically a resource that's purchased by people looking to finance a really large solar field somewhere, rather than doing complex planning. So I think this is a huge resource that we offer to the Caribbean region. And you can get to all of it through this link here, nsrdb.nrel.gov. And we have some site-specific tools, which I'll talk a little bit more just quickly, and they pull in all of this data automatically. So the SAM tool, REOP tool, etc. You may have run into some of this solar radiation data in the past. There was something called the TMY1, TMY2, TMY3 data the first set of gridded data, and now what we've got here, which has been built out over probably the last 8 years or so. And I think that's, just want to include this slide to let you know that this is a constantly evolving thing. So if you've run into it in the past, good to take a new look at it. Other resource data, unfortunately, we don't have great hydro data sets or geothermal data sets outside of the country, outside of the continental US at least. IRRP has some information on geothermal and some resource data. It is really important when looking at these data sets to make sure that they're up to date and anticipating, particularly for hydro, which is a long-term investment, you know, how is that rainfall pattern going to change over the coming years? And so that's a important question to take into account when building out those resources. But if those resources, geothermal and hydro in particular, are there and available, it would be really good to investigate deploying them. Utility rates. We have this is really relevant for behind the meter analysis or distributed analysis. So distributed PV analysis is an area where we use it a lot. NREL has a database of utility rates, and it is primarily for utilities in the US, but we have the ability to add additional rates, or we can set it up so that local people can add rates as well. And we've done that for several Central American countries in particular through various projects. And I think that's a resource, not a data gathering resource, but understanding what those rates look like now and how that will impact particularly any distributed generation planning. I'm just going to keep going, but it does have a lot of structure in the URDB that could be used to represent rates. Electric loads, we have a lot of sample buildings, and there are climate zone focused buildings that would be appropriate for the Caribbean. Bunch of different types of buildings, different building structures, so you can download kind of typical building load data. And then incentive information, incentives, subsidies, taxes are all critical to planning in terms of cost. This is just an example. This is the database for state incentives for renewables and efficiency in the US Desire. Likely not appropriate, but I think it just speaks to the fact of how important capturing all of these incentives and subsidies are in the planning process as you work to determine what's the best choice. Finally, where does all this data go? There's a lot of tools out there. I'm going to speak kind of from an NREL perspective. We have built a couple tools across this entire spectrum, from annual type analysis here at this end, all the way to microsecond analysis over here. And the way I think about it, at least, is you kind of start over here, you build out, hey, what do we want to accomplish? Do we have goals for our future grid in terms of reliability and perhaps resilience and renewables, et cetera, cost goals? And we look at kind of a capacity expansion model that could be Plexos LT, which is another capacity expansion model. And then we say, okay, that's great. Is that future grid going to hold together? Are we going to have any loss of load? In other words, blackouts, brownouts, is any of that going to be an issue? And then we move down into some of these tools to say, hey, now that we've kind of got it at a big picture level, geez, are we going to have any issues with transmission or with the distribution grid? Are there going to be any fluctuations of voltage that we need to worry about? You know, what does that look like? And then kind of the minute-to-minute sort of operation. So you don't really run these models here for a whole year or several years or decades, but you would run them for specific situations about the future grid that you're worried about. You know, what happens if all the PV comes on at once on the island? Does that cause a spike in the voltage or a drop in the voltage, or, you know, what's that look like? Or if a particular industrial customer comes on, can we handle that with the system that we're talking about? So that's kind of that range. The other way to kind of categorize some of these models and tools that we think about is in terms of, as I said, temporal resolution, all the way from sub-hourly to hourly, and then at what scale. So we have a bunch of tools, SAM and REOPT, that are working at this specific site. So you say, oh, I want to look at a specific solar plant, or I want to look at a solar plus battery system. Those tools can do that. As you move into some of these other tools, you're looking at the entire system. And then we even have global tools up here, which aren't probably relevant, but kind of thinking about it in these kind of geographic scopes and temporal resolutions helps me at least kind of keep track of how all these models fit together. And then I'm not going to go through this, but this is our Reed's model, which is a large model. This is another model, the RPM model, which is also open source and available, and can look at smaller systems. Obviously, then Plexus is another large tool that we use to look at the operational modeling of the grid. And all of this data sort of flows into these. You know, for small systems, tools like Homer Energy and some of the Zendy is another one for kind of small grids or small island grids, depending on the size of the system. Looking at, you know, what should we add next? Where should we go? What's the optimum? And what are the constraints on the system? And all of it's helping to answer some of these questions in terms of resource planning for the future. So with that, I will turn it over to the next speaker, and happy to answer questions when we get to that point.
Thank you. I'm the next speaker, correct?
Yes,
Harry?
Juanita, go ahead.
Thank you. All right. So I'm going to share my screen. I don't know if you need to unshare.
No, you just go ahead. I think it overrides.
Okay, hang on. Okay, go to presentation. All right, can you all see that?
Seeing it clearly, yep.
Get to the start would help, wouldn't it? Okay. All right, so I'm Juanita Heidel. I am with ICF. I manage our energy services group focused on federal clients. So that includes domestically EPA and DOE, but also USAID. And so we have done some work in integrated resource planning, integrated resource and resilience planning in Tanzania and Ghana and some other places. So today my task was to talk about data requirements associated with what I'll call the second R, the resilience piece of this. So how do you get the data to begin to look at some of the uncertainties? So I'm going to do that. I think I necessarily have to give a little context in how we do IRRP. And so there's going to be some background material here and a little bit of repetition just because of the language. I like to repeat it because it's not intuitive sometimes, and I want to make sure folks understand how we're doing this work and how the data requirements fit into that second R. So let me say a little bit about IRRP generally. Historically, utilities and others planned on a least cost basis. It was least cost integrated resource planning, and over time, particularly with changes in climate, it became clear that you needed to sort of account a little more explicitly for risk. And so IRRP does that explicitly, addresses the risk and resiliency concerns that might affect your system from climate change, but also from other aspects, fuel risk, technology risk, development risk, investment risk, those kinds of things. So IRRP addresses that. It does that by looking at alternative investment portfolios or portfolio strategies, as I'll call them, that you might make that might be driven by national goals. You know, maybe there's a renewable goals, maybe there's an environmental goal. How those perform under a range of uncertainties, including climate change or regulatory changes or other uncertainties that might happen. And the goal is not to focus so much on a least cost plan, but what I'll call a least regrets plan. And that is one that is robust and resilient against a range of possible future outcomes, because your baseline set of assumptions probably aren't going to play out as you expected. And so you want to find yourself in a position where you've chosen an investment strategy that doesn't leave you in a high cost situation if the future doesn't unwind as you expected it to. So for example, perhaps hydro is your least cost strategy if things play out as you expect them to in a business as usual world. But if you experience a drought situation, that could end up being your most expensive investment strategy. And so you want to look at a range of investment strategies under a range of future uncertainties and figure out which one of those is most robust and leaves you with the least regrets. And I like to think of it as an insurance policy that I might pay a little bit more for that least regrets plan, but I'm ensuring that I don't end up in the worst possible situation in terms of cost and other outcomes. And so that's the sort of the background on IRRP. You know, traditionally the focus might be on cost, but here it's focused on resilience, ensuring you have a robust system, but also adds elements beyond cost that you might want to explicitly consider, like environmental outcomes, land use impacts, jobs impacts, climate change. And I'll talk a little bit about more on that in a second. So I want to just talk a little bit about the language of IRRP, just because I'm going to use a lot of these words going forward, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So reference case is sort of what everybody understands that to be a business as usual scenario, existing laws and policies, expected conditions for technology costs and fuel prices and so forth. And that is something, you know, all the data that Nate just reviewed, you would develop a sort of a reference case for that data. You could run that through your planning model and come up with a least cost plan. Strategies are those things that are in your control. As I just mentioned, you might have a corporate strategy or a national government strategy to focus on renewables. You might have something that focuses on an emissions goal. You might have a development of indigenous resources might be one of your goals. So those are things that you have control over and explicitly decide to pursue. A specific portfolio strategy or investment strategy. Scenarios are things that are outside the planner's control. Uncertainty of demand, climate impacts, fuel technologies. Those are where you want to use a risk and resilience assessment to identify those risks that are most important to your system. And you also want to take all of the strategies that you're examining, say you have 3 different strategies, and you want to see how they perform under all those uncertainties. And so, for example, we'll talk about Tanzania, where we looked at 7 different uncertainties, scenarios, I'm going to call them. And then we looked at 3 different strategies. And so we had a total of 21 different modeling runs that we looked at, generated data for, got a lot of data out of, and then examined which of those constituted the best plan, the least regrets plan. Metrics are the basis by which you evaluate those plans. How am I measuring the performance of the plan? Cost might be net present value of the system cost, might be rate impacts, might be total capital requirement is one metric, but there might be others like job impacts or climate change or emissions, greenhouse gas emissions or other kinds of emissions. Could be land use impacts. We'll look at some of those metrics later, but that's how you measure the performance of the different investment strategies under alternative scenarios. And as I said, the least regrets is the one that performs best under all those uncertainties. So this is sort of a framework for IRRP, kind of what the pieces are, what the flow is, I guess. That first horizontal box, I'll call it bucket, is data and assumptions. And this is much of what Nate just talked about. This is the data you need to drive a least cost planning model. These are data hungry tools. And so there is a lot of information required. You'll see this arrow that goes from the assumptions for key drivers and inputs to sensitivities and scenarios. A lot of the data that you need to develop inputs for sensitivity analysis come from the same sources you're using to get your main business as usual kinds of data. And we'll talk about that in a minute, and some of the same tools. But as part of this IRRP process, you're going to develop a baseline set of data, and then you're going to determine how do I tweak that data or adjust it or make assumptions about it so that I can look at the sensitivities, that I can develop the resilience piece of this analysis. Some of those tools, demand forecasting tools, if you have a good model that will tell you what the business as usual demand forecast is, you can maybe use that tool to look at sensitivity to climate change, for example, temperature changes. That was a stretch in Tanzania where we didn't have really great demand models and very little detailed demand data. But in the US, for example, we have done that nationally, looked at the impacts of changing expectations on degree days, for example, on demand. And so it's just whether you have that historic data. But that same tool you use to develop your business as usual can also be used to develop your uncertainty analysis. Energy efficiency, if you've done an assessment and you looked at potential market penetration for energy efficiency, you can use those same tools to look at what if the market doesn't respond as I expect, or what if the impacts are not quite what I expect. So again, you're just doing sensitivities using input tools, input data and models that you've used to develop your business as usual case. And then all that, of course, gets fed into the long-term power sector planning model. Now let's move to Tanzania and just talk a little bit about kind of what we did specifically on climate risk, but also other risk. So Tanzania has historically been very dependent on hydropower as a resource. It, I think at some point had half of its energy coming from hydropower. And then about 2015, there was a drought that hit, and I think there were immediately blackouts, bad situation. They had to act pretty quickly to bring emergency generation under contract, a PPA they executed with, I think it was a diesel-based system, which turned out to have very high costs and terrible rate implications. They weren't in fact recovering all the costs for that system. And so when we began to do this IRRP, it was clear that climate risks were something we had to pay a lot of attention to. And so I'll speak to it in a minute, but we did some fairly sophisticated modeling of the hydro system to develop alternative scenarios of climate risks to that system. But we also looked at them as increasingly being dependent on natural gas fuel. And so we wanted to look at fuel and investment risk with respect to natural gas and natural gas pipeline development. And then on the demand side, this was a system that was growing very rapidly, 12, 15% growth per year. And so we wanted to look at what happened if that growth could be either higher or lower. What were the implications of that on the system? So those were the key uncertainties we were looking at. I'm going to skip that. So Nate showed you all those tools. We had a tool we applied, our integrated planning model. It's a tool we've developed over many decades. It's similar, I would say, to REEDS. It's a long-term dispatch and capacity expansion model. Operates at whatever level you feed it data for. At a national level, we implemented on a US-Canada basis for many of our clients here. In Tanzania, we modeled it at the country level, but had external sort of pipes to the neighboring countries. And so we used IPM in the IRRP to identify kind of what the results of what the solutions were under those different strategies and under scenarios, and to develop all the metrics we needed. IPM, like any of these tools, is very data hungry. This is, many of the same data pieces Nate just showed you. I'll tell you what happened when we got to Tanzania. Tanzania was a fly-in, fly-out project. We were not based there in country we didn't have a permanent office. And so we showed up on day one and we had a nice long list of data requirements that we would have liked them to give us. And it became clear very quickly that they had none of this data in any comprehensive form that was going to be immediately useful to us. And so we ended up putting someone in country for about 6 weeks, just in the desk next to the desk of the appropriate people at TANESCO, collecting this data. And as was noted, I think in the survey, much of it was buried in models that they hadn't used recently or had been implemented by somebody else that they couldn't really get it out efficiently. Much of it was in paper files that just had never been sort of put into any database or spreadsheet even. Much of it was in the heads of the planners that just hadn't put it down on paper. So it was a pretty major effort for us to collect this data. We set about, you know, we use this model all the time in our consulting, and so we have pretty good systems in place in-house to develop and store and make this data easily accessible. And so we went about sort of developing those tools and systems for TANESCO. And so we always work what we call an assumptions workbook that has, you know, I don't know, dozens of tabs, but every one is an input to the model. And we, you know, have the stream of data that we need historically, and we just build that, you know, we have a core data set that we build that for through time and improve, you know, as each project and each set of new data comes out nationally or wherever. And so we built that system for TANESCO so that they weren't just, you know, having piles of paper in various databases. We had a single place to house all this data. We, you know, got as much as we could. There were lots of gaps. We went, as Nate described, to some of the national sources and default sources. We're pretty good at figuring that out because this happens all the time, not so much in the US, but for lots of projects, you just have to go figure out what your best source of data is. And so we built that system for them and, you know, tried to make clear that you need to house that separately and maintain it separately and create a knowledge system around that, as opposed to sticking these things into models and never seeing them again. And so we did that effort and got to a point where we were comfortable with the data and were able to, you know, run that through the model in sort of a least cost or expected case situation. And then we went to develop our portfolio strategies. And there were three. We had a reference case, which was just sort of business as usual. And then we looked at a couple of others, and the details of this are not important. I more want to talk to you about how we got to the assumptions behind this data. We had a limited large-scale investment strategy. Tanzania had made a commitment to building out the Stiegler's Gorge Dam. It's a 2.5 gigawatt dam down in the southern part of the country that is quite large compared to their load. And so that had significant implications, but they had committed to that. And so we looked at a case where they didn't focus on a case where we didn't do that and a case where we did do that. So we sort of looked at a broad range of scenarios, of strategies rather. And then we went to develop the scenarios. What was going to be important to the TANESCO system in terms of risk and sensitivities to those particular investment strategies. So again, we identified from the start these climate, demand, and fuel and investment risk. And we worked then to put a little more finer detail on those. And let me talk about how we did that. We held a 3-day risk and resilience assessment workshop where we got all the smart people in the room, the lead generation planner, the lead hydro person. We had the Ministry of Water there. We had a key fuels person, just the people, you know, TANESCO is not very large, so just the key people who understood what the system risks were. And we just worked through kind of what they thought their system was most vulnerable to. Drought clearly was at the top of the list, but there was this concern over the growing dependence on natural gas and these pipelines that were being constructed. Load was clearly an issue. Outages in terms of the future risk that might be brought into the system because you were building this very large plant relative to the size of your load. And then what would happen if there were delays in this? You're banking your system on a pretty big addition. What happens if that gets delayed? So those are the things we focused on. Again, there was no model, no set of numbers we were crunching. We just got the right people in the room and worked through it in a pretty organized sort of facilitated workshop. Led by our lead modeler and then Molly Helmuth, who did the water resources modeling, to get to the answers of what is your system vulnerable to and what do we need to be focused on in these analyses. And as you'll see in a little bit, a lot of the data required to run these were not, again, the drought was a big modeling effort, but a lot of them were sort of 0-1 questions about things get delayed to a certain date and so on. So not a lot of data required. However, there are other risks where you would need to develop data, like Nate mentioned some of these. New technology cost and performance. You want to definitely some systems will want to look at a range of variables around that. You have an expected value for costs and maybe performance of renewable resources, but perhaps they don't perform as expected. Perhaps they don't deliver on peak as you expect. Maybe your existing unit's performance isn't as you expect. You want to be able to look at a range of those things. That is tough. The US has a fair amount of data in that. The EIA, for example, puts out a lot of information on high and low reference case scenarios and so on. But internationally, it gets a little tougher in terms of how to find that data. But again, where there's a will, there's a way, and sometimes you might have to draw parallels between your international data and other domestic data or other international data. As I mentioned earlier, some of your models and tools that you use to develop your baseline estimates can be used here. So if you have a good demand model, you can perhaps develop some alternative scenarios, either driven by climate data or economic data, to get alternative demand forecasts. For efficiency, again, if you've developed an assessment tool, you can look at different market penetration rates or different performance rates of the technology. So the same tools you use to develop your base set of assumptions can be used to look at this risk and resilience issue. So we did 7 scenarios, as I said. Baseline was just least cost. Drought, I'll talk about in a minute. For the load scenarios, we didn't have good models, so we simply picked a high scenario from a prior power system master plan. And for moderate, we averaged a baseline and a high. And so that was pretty simple. For Stigler's Gorge outage, that was the outage scenario. We assumed that equipment failures prevented the hydropower, and I'll give you more details of that in a minute. Same with gas pipeline, we assumed an outage for a period of time, and then delayed development was just things are pushed back. Again, sort of 0-1 assumptions. On hydro, we did model this extensively because it was such an important resource and a future resource they wanted to depend on very much. So we looked at we use the WEEP model, which you all may be familiar with. It's a water evaluation and planning model. It's developed by Stockholm Environment Institute. They worked with us on this. Very detailed model that models stream flow for the main rivers in Tanzania, those that feed into key hydropower plants. It produces information on total water supply delivered and electricity produced by the various plants. So it's very detailed. We had data, SEI came with a lot of data, but we also had other information available to us. So in the assumptions, we ran from 2016 to 2040, compared that to a reference case. You'll see here a baseline. And this is annual rainfall and the baseline in a drought. I'm going to get to the more interesting piece in a minute, which is generation. But we use this model running, and so the outputs of this model were inputs to IPM. And so we did a number of climate scenarios and decided on which would go into IPM. And then those were alternatives to the baseline, alternative hydropower inputs under a climate scenario. And that's what constituted our risk assessment and our risk scenario for climate. So this is the generation under the outputs of that model. So a 30% reduction in stream flow. You'll see this orange drought line, appropriately orange, I guess, or brown. 8% reduction in water supply delivered, and then 12% reduction in hydropower generation. So this was a fair amount of work to get to this, but it was important enough in Tanzania that we wanted to do this. And we did train people in the tool, and there's a capability there that could be adopted and used going forward. So the other scenarios, as I said, these were sort of 0-1 situations. So we wanted to model a pipeline outage scenario. And so in that case, we just assumed that, there was a pipeline problem and the natural gas was lost for 1 year. So what in the modeling, you introduce that absence, and the model has to react and figure out how it's going to respond to meet demand. And so it incurs some short-term costs, adjusts maybe a little better in the long term, but the model is reacting to your cutting off the supply of gas in those units. Same with Stigler's Gorge, we assume that it gets lost, and so obviously the model's got to do something very short term to respond. It may even include outages, depending on what you've sort of included as your willingness to pay in the model. Delayed development is the same thing. You've got only so much foresight on that, and so the model has to react. So again, these were not deep modeling. This was more talking to the experts and understanding what would be a reasonable scenario to model, and then modeling that and seeing how the system reacts in response to these unexpected outcomes. So again, this is where we ran the model 21 times, 3 different strategies under 7 different scenarios of uncertainty, and we developed metrics. And so what are these metrics? Metrics are how we measure the performance of the different investment strategies, portfolio strategies under uncertainty. You know, in the least cost planning world, it's net present value of the system cost, or maybe you look at dollars per megawatt hour over time. For Tanzania, we had 33 metrics. These are just the buckets of metrics. We had a lot of data that we looked at. You know, there were cost metrics. There were sort of stability of rates that we wanted to look at so that rates didn't climb too quickly in any period of time. There was obviously reliability metrics we included. There was an environmental metrics focused on carbon. There was a diversity metric. And again, some of these were measured in multiple ways. And then there was a land use metric. And so out of these 21 runs, you have to generate all this data. Sometimes you need other information to do that, like you need to understand the land use implications of different technologies. And so if the model tells you you've built X megawatts of wind, you need some way to translate that into land use. And so there's a data collection element there as well into using these metrics. Or perhaps there's a jobs metric that you want to have. And so you want some understanding of, if I build a nuclear plant versus a coal plant versus a wind plant, what are the jobs implications over time? And that's some multipliers you can develop to sort of help you make that translation. There's also a question of how you weight these, and I'm not going into this in any detail, but how you weight these metrics so that you value appropriately the most important things. So maybe cost has a higher weighting than land use. Those are decisions that the senior folks, planners, need to make in setting up the math on this. Really, it's just some math to appropriately weight each of these metrics and therefore objectively compare the outcomes of the runs. And then you have to use all that in decision making. You know, it's a lot of data, but it is a very objective, systematic way to get to some numbers that let you evaluate what's the most robust plans for your system. That all obviously has to be turned into short-term action plans, long-term and medium-term action plans, and then identify the changes and regulatory and policy changes you need to make these things happen and down the line. I want to just spend a couple seconds on lessons learned in this process with Tanzania. You know, this is discussions about data management, and it's, you know, as we started off, it's critical, you know, to being able to do a defensible and solid and useful IRRP and do a robust analysis. And it's not a one-time deal. You have to keep doing this, which is why it's so important to develop a system like an assumptions book, as we call it, where you're documenting your rationale for every assumption, and you have the ability to look back where you were and where you're going and how you've improved the data over time. Having standardized templates for data processing like this assumption book, but also, you know, we built, for example, some demand models that were just, I can't tell you how long it took us to get the demand model from Tanesco that they had been using, but we built some others that were just more standardized in terms of being able to keep your data streams going over time as you collected more data, being able to document the models that you built and why you chose that model over another. Just the ability to maintain and improve those tools over time, and sort of look at after the fact, sort of how they performed. One thing we did do is at the tail end of the project, we ended up doing a survey, a sample survey of several of the regions to see if we could improve data collection on end use in the homes and levels of consumption and so on. And so we did a load survey, you know, for selected regions just to demonstrate that it could be done. And so hopefully that would be something they might in the future adopt. The other thing is in Tanzania, it was a little different than, say, for Ghana, where we had a very collaborative stakeholder process. In Tanzania, it was, you know, we had a much more limited stakeholder process. And so the data availability and planning would be improved over time if you engaged more ministries and had a more collaborative process, like in Ghana, where there was a team effort to build the data sets, literally hands-on, where all the ministries, all the utilities, the distributors, and so on were building these data sets for the modeling. And then to institutionalize it, just make sure that you're not doing this once, but that every 2 or 3 years you're continually updating the data, but updating the modeling every 2 or 3 years, and that you have an established calendar timetable for data collection, stakeholder engagement, and running the modeling. And then that you have the regulatory frameworks to support this. If you need data collection, can you build that into the policies and regulations of the country to have appropriate data collection, have appropriate surveys, and so forth, and timelines for the IRRP. So I'm going to leave it at that. I don't know if we want to take questions now or later. Right. I think you're on mute, Jerry, if you're.
Once again, defeated by my headset. We do have one question. The answer for this one might be a little bit long, so actually let's try and take it now. After the Tanzania experience, what recommendations would you have on how to improve data collection or to approach the data collection phase of an IRRP differently?
I think clearly in that case, you need to be on the ground with the company. It's just not something that's going to happen remotely. People have day jobs. And so, it took us a little bit to realize that. And so we eventually just had someone on the ground. Now, if you're doing it, we obviously with consultants and they're doing the work. And so if that is not the case and you're doing it internally, you need to have someone dedicated to it. It can't be a part-time job or I'll get to it at the end of my 40. It has to be something you've got someone dedicated to. It is not, we internally, for example, we use IPM in our consulting and it's a big part of our business. We have people who do nothing but data development. For our commercial work and for our government work, we have, certain clients who maintain their own data. It's a full-time job, really, for 1 or 2 people to maintain that data and keep it clean and document it and so on. Where we use it, for example, for the EPA, they do their regulatory work using IPM. We have like this very extensive system of data and databases and queries and so on that we maintain and document extensively. It's not a part-time job. It's, we have a person and a half probably doing just that.
Needed human resources, can't go around it. Thanks for that, Juanita. Please, please keep asking your questions. We will get to them as they come in. But for now, let's now turn to Gail Mosey.
Thanks, Jerry, and thanks for everyone. Thanks to everyone for having me today. I'm Gail Mosey. I'm here with the National Renewable Energy Lab, also known as NREL. I'm here today to talk to you about data collection process and methodology for running tools and models for communities. The thinking for me being here is that this process may relate to the IRRP process and data collection. So the purpose of our key data collection framework is to standardize the data points gathered from communities based on key data requirements to run priority tools and models. We're doing this to be more targeted in the data that we request. We have a list of key data requirements to run tools and models often used with communities. Tools such as Engage, System Advisor Model, which Nate discussed, and the Renewable Energy Optimization Model. Our goal is to decrease the weight on communities for data collection and gather necessary data and information to move forward in an organized and streamlined way. We're accomplishing this by using existing resources plus requesting data through a data template from communities. From a research perspective, as we continue to use the data template, we can see where communities seldom have the data needed and then integrate that into our tools and approach. We have a comprehensive list of data needs with data for some communities already populated. NREL has used the data sources listed here to gather data and information for communities. This list is meant to be representative and is not comprehensive of all the data sources available, but just wanted to give you an idea. For the purposes of communities, we've identified 3 tiers of NREL models and tools that would be useful for them. The first tier is high level and includes the model called Engage, which you'll hear more about from Sartouch, who will be presenting next. The second tier is regional level and includes models such as Renewable Energy Integration and Optimization Model, also known as REOPT, and also the Regional Energy Deployment System, also known as READS. Tier 3 is considered project level and includes System Advisor Model, or SAM, PV Watts Calculator, and the Jobs and Economic Development Impact Model, also known as JEDI. Please note that this is our first brush past the identifying the models that are relevant and categorizing them in tiers. So this is certainly open to suggestion and also input in terms of which models, which additional models may be included in these tiers that would be helpful and useful to communities. Through our evaluation of data needs for community models and tools, we were able to segment them into categories that you'll see here of economy, resource and geospatial data, power plants and fuels, grid and transmission, transportation, and policies and regulations. You'll see here the same categories as on the previous slide, but with some additional details about the types of data that would be included. For instance, for resource data and geospatial, we're interested in gathering data such as renewable energy resource availability, parcel data, and distribution and generation locations. Now I'll turn this over to Sartouch to present a few slides.
Hi, and thank you, Gail. I'm having an echo on my headphone. Is it because of my microphone? I don't know.
You sound
okay. It's better right now. Perfect. So yeah, thank you, Gail. And as she has mentioned, our first tier model is the Engage model, and Engage model is providing us some high-level analysis between the supply and the demand side of the energy flow. So on the supply side, there are the power plants, of course. Like there's a short list of power plants in here, including all the biomass, coal, and non-renewables as well, plus the renewable power plants or whatever supply available in the community. And on the demand side, which is just at the right-hand side of that table, is the demand from the community. It can be an electrical demand, a heat load, or individual demand from the hospitals, houses, or any kind of small units. And in between the supply and demand, we have the storage, conversion, and the transmission stages, which the model allows us to model if there is storage available. It can be a battery storage or thermal storage. It can be a water reservoir for hydropower dams, or even natural gas storage. And for the conversion, so we can have some combined heat and power plants, hydropower generators, and other non-renewable natural gas combustion turbines and other kind of conversion units, which is linking to the transmission network, including the power transmission lines, and not restricted to the power. It can also be heat pipelines and natural gas pipelines and any kind of transmission between that supply plus that conversion plus storage options all the way to the demand side. So having said that, next slide, please. Thank you. Having said that, so this structure has 4 main data categories, or the model calls this as constraints. The first one is the resource constraints, which includes the available resource, the resource consumption, minimum and maximum consumption during the peak times, and the land use or the installed area of that resource is falling into this category. And the second constraint is on the technology, which includes the capacity factor of the power plants, the annual generations, total installed capacities, and how the generation fits the demand in terms of their ramping rates or minimum operating capacities. Also, the technology lifetime is the power plant last like 30 years or 20 years. So that falls into that technology category. And then the other one is the storage constraints, similar to the technology constraints. So we can talk about the charging rates, the minimum and maximum storage capacities, and also the losses through the storage, between the storage and the grid or the pipeline. And finally, of course, everything comes to money, and the monetary cost constraints or cost items are important. Your resource and all structure can be perfectly in line, but if your financing is not good, that may not be a feasible project. And this part includes that, such as the interest rates, the O&M structures, resource costs, depreciation rates, like energy cost per capacity. Those kind of things fall into this monetary cost. And then next slide, please. And then we have an input structure. This is a snap input structure in Excel format. Actually, Engage is an online tool. So when you have your account through Engage web page, you can start building your models and input your data. But we exported that to an Excel format that the user can navigate through these 5 stages of data pieces, and then try to input whatever available. So this can be, in terms of availability, I can just say this can be annual average data, monthly data, and if possible, hourly generation data or hourly demand data. So if we have the hourly data, of course, we get more precise, but if you don't have the hourly data, the tool is also capable of modeling these systems on monthly average or annual, even annual production and consumption sides of these 2 pieces of, or 2 ends of this structure. So yeah, this is how the data structure looks like. Next slide, please. Yep. So the Engage was our first tier of data modeling because of its easiness to use and high level of information it requires. But of course, as data gets more complicated and more available, we can switch to that tier 2 and tier 3 type of model, such as ReOpt, Reads, System Advisor Model, or JEDI. And in ReOpt, the main idea is technically optimizing the system. And in this tool, if we have that hourly data for production, then it is a better way of optimizing system. So we need a little bit more details in that tier 2 and tier 3 models in terms of their annual generations, hourly generations, grid connectivities, any kind of losses during generation. And in addition to ReOpt, we have the Reads, as Nate also mentioned in his presentation. It's more like the regional development, and Reads also has some forecasts. So we can just model today's situation, but we can the tool also allows us to forecast for next 30 years of production. If we come to System Advisor model, it is a little bit different than the others, because in System Advisor model we can model specific plants and its techno-economic analysis together with system design options, which gives us the opportunity to look at both the system specifications plus financial models, which give us cash flows, discounted cash flow analysis, and also a result of it is LCOE, the levelized cost of electricity of a specific project. And last, JEDI is a tool that shows the impact of all of these to the economy as jobs created by these renewable projects. And this is kind of one of the end products that after you have all the models and tools working, JEDI will also provide the impact of these to the economy. And this is how the model structure actually works with these models. Next slide, please. I think I'm going to switch back to Gail at this moment, if she wants to summarize and highlight how are we approaching to the data collection to support these tools that NREL has. Thank you.
Thanks, Sartaj. That was super helpful. We're just getting started on this effort of community data collection, but I did want to just summarize our approach. We are aligning and prioritizing data requirements relative to the tools that are often used with communities to identify the critical data needs that are required to run those tools. What we're doing is gathering data for pilot communities through existing sources and requesting data also from the communities. We'll then run a sampling of tools and models to show effectiveness of data gathering strategy and methodology. We'll also identify gaps in available data for each community and create portfolios for each community with representative tools and models. And based on gaps identified, we can suggest areas where proxy or synthetic data could be used and develop proxy data for the data gaps in a selected community. From there, we can use the proxy data for a sample community to run the models and tools, plus current data to conduct a representative tool and modeling run to show the effectiveness of the proxy data. So we're hoping that by developing the proxy data and then running a model or tool, that we can determine whether or not the proxy data or synthetic data was effective and can use it again in the future. So thank you to everyone for your time and attention. And now I'll hand this back for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Gail. I'm looking through the Q&A section now to see if we have very many questions, and we don't, as a matter of fact. But I will ask one or two just to get the ball rolling. And this is going back, I think, to Juanita, whose bit about Tanzania I thought was really, really useful. I really appreciate the very practical perspective of having gone through that process. I'd want Juanita, if you could, to speak a bit more about how the utility or how the government agencies who were your counterparts, if you can, how they took some of the lessons of the process forward, as in you saw some aspects of how data is collected, you saw certain gaps, you saw the lack of human capacity in some places and the need for someone kind of full-time to sit down on it. Did that change the way that the government or the utility went about data collection afterwards? Were there any policy changes that might have come as a result of this work?
Yeah, I would like to say there were, but I'm not sure there were. We are not there now. It was a one-off project through a vehicle we had with USAID. I do think that they're trying to reinitiate some of that with, there's a new contractor there, I think it's RTI. So the issues in Tanzania were, how do I say this? The utility had its goal to improve its planning and so forth, but there was sort of a lot of stuff happening at the ministry and other places, and so the problem was those two things were not quite coming together when we were there. And so there were parallel plans being done, and I just discovered yesterday, I guess they've updated another plan that someone else has done So there just were sort of competing analyses going on, and so that was sort of sapping resources and not allowing everybody to sort of get on the same plane. But we did a lot of capacity building, a lot of training in the tool, and so even if they're not applying this tool, I think we ended up teaching them a lot about just planning in general, because the level of sophistication was not there in terms of understanding what needed to be done, how you did it, how you tied all these things together. They had been through it, but generally with not the level of hands-on approach that we did. And so we were there with them, did a lot of on the computer sessions where we were running the tool and showing them how to update the data and hands-on, and we left them with a model and a computer and a system in place. I just think there wasn't the wherewithal to sort of keep that going. So we're hopeful maybe it'll come back, but so I think we taught them a lot. It's just I don't know that they've been able to totally apply it yet.
I got you. Sometimes that follow-up is critical, eh? But I mean, it's all dependent on funding and the parameters of the assignment.
Yep.
To you again, Juanita, but really to anybody, are there any data sets, assumptions, or projections that in your experience are particularly difficult to find consensus on?
All of them.
So there weren't any that were easier than others, or some that were much more obscure. Well, I guess it might be specific to the Tanzania case.
Yeah.
You said you had mentioned you worked in Ghana as well. Was there some differences there? Some things harder than others?
Yeah, no, that's Ghana's probably the better example. So in Ghana, we did have a very collaborative process where literally people were in the room hammering out assumptions on everything from technology costs to, detailed unit data to what the strategies and scenarios were. And so there was a lot of conversation about what the appropriate strategies should be. And so in that case, you just are more inclusive than exclusive. To make sure everyone's heard. I can recall there was a big discussion on nuclear, whether that should be part of a resource mix and why were they evaluating it. But nuclear was included in some of the strategies that were examined. I think we did 21 in Tanzania. I think they did far more than that in terms of runs. Because they had so many voices in the room. But they're at a much higher level than Tanzania in terms of the quality of the data. They've been doing a lot of this analysis for many years. Their problem was too much energy, too much capacity, because they had signed so many deals, and so they were sort of in a little different place. But I think that
I dig what you're saying there, Juanita. But in some respects, the approach doesn't necessarily rely on the amount of sophistication that you have in terms of your data collection, right? Like if you don't have a lot of data, fine. But if you agree to an approach like you mentioned in Ghana, where everyone's in a room and it's very, very collaborative, even in a situation where you don't necessarily have the best data sets to pull on, that at least probably gets you a bit further, you know what I mean, in terms of identifying what can be improved upon and then cementing the desire to improve after the project ends. If you have people who are a core group of people who are around the issue, then maybe after you have this engagement, people can say, we still need to fix that problem. We need to fix the other problem.
Yeah, no, that created an entirely different level of commitment there. They were very committed to it. Yep.
Throw out the same question to the rest of the team from NREL. Any other thoughts or perspectives on this one? Doesn't quite sound so. Or somebody coming there. Go ahead.
Hi, it's Gail. I would say that, I think that agree with Juanita's assessment. I think that from our perspective, we're working through the effort of gathering data through secondary sources, developing our template, and then we'll reach out to communities to kind of vet that data to make sure that it looks good to them, and then also to populate areas that we weren't able to find data. So I will say that we're at the earlier stage of that, and it's, I can't say for sure. I anticipate, some challenges in gathering it, but it remains to be seen. I think some aspects of it will be easier and more attainable than others, and then some we may have to kind of use our proxy type data approach.
Expand on that, please, Gail. Which ones do you think will be easier? Which ones will be harder?
I think some of the economic, the demographic type data will be easy. Some of the resource availability, the generation sources and the generation amount. Load data will, load data is there. It's just a matter of how fine we can get it, how precise we can get it. And so to some extent, we'll be able to receive information that I think is maybe higher level, easier. And then as we kind of get down a little bit more into the details, may get a little bit more tricky to gather. Nate might have something to add to that. I saw he turned on his video too.
Nate, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add, I think that in a lot of these cases, if it's hard to find consensus, that's a good time to do a series of scenarios, right? So that the stakeholders can see. One of the tricky questions is usually load growth, where certain people in the government want to say, hey, we're going to have all this huge economic growth over the next few years. That's what we've planned on. But the historical load growth is maybe much, much, much lower or zero. And so you want to be able in the modeling to present, hey, we're not taking a position necessarily, but here are several different scenarios that ideally bracket, where the future is going to be, and as Juanita was saying, kind of give you a solution that's robust to a lot of uncertainty, going forward. And I think so. I think one way around figuring out exactly what the perfect number is or the perfect data piece is to know that you've bracketed kind of the uncertainty around those data items.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. Yeah. Juanita, did you want to come back on that one? I'm wondering in particular. Okay.
I was just agreeing on the bracketing. Bracketing's good.
True.
Jerry, I think your mic is off.
Oh, I keep doing that, don't I? Apologies. Yeah, I'm not seeing too many questions in the Q&A, so I'm figuring that a good enough job was done. But I just got texted one here. And this one's for everybody. I suppose we'll start with NREL this time. Speaking to the resilience part of an IRRP, we had the clear example of drought in Tanzania. It opens up a whole new set of considerations, data, and uncertainties. Any thoughts on more broad adaptation and the data required for things like increasing rise in temperature? Let me augment that question a bit. Climate change just adds so many uncertainties, because you're departing from the data set that you've had so far for a particular climate variable. In that kind of context, what sort of data or what sort of scenarios, what sort of data are required? Like, how do you go about figuring out this very uncertain future, given the increased variability that one expects with climate change?
I can go first on that, Nate, and then you could go. I think that this is reminding me of a conversation that we had with one of our resilience experts at NREL, and she got wind of what we were doing, the project that we're doing with gathering data, and she asked if she could add a resilience component. So I kind of had that honeycomb chart where we showed the different kind of segments of data that we're going to try to gather, and the resilience was one of those. And so I think, you know, as far as specifically what data, she kind of has a list of data. So, you know, it's going to have to do with temperature, water, drought aspects of things. And so I think that, you know, kind of characterizing the different areas with their set of resilience factors could be really valuable and important. And what we're thinking is that while we're in this data collection effort, it might make sense to, you know, add that component on, and, you know, it's like, it's easier to do it while you're doing it, you know, so not add it later and think, oh gosh, I wish we had collected this, but do it while we're going through the process of it. So yeah, great question.
Nate, you want to come in too?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's important in planning, and I tried to stress that with what we anticipate future costs will be going down, is thinking about, you know, climate change. It's some of it's here already, some more of it's coming in the future. Costs for solar and battery storage in particular are anticipated to continue to come down, and so I think you can come up with sort of where do we want to be in 10 years, and then you can have a second conversation about when do we want to be adding that. What are the risks we're willing to take over the next 2 years? You know, what happens if say a climate event or a hurricane or something happens in this time frame? What do we want to do now versus what can maybe be taken as a slightly future action? So I think there's a lot of, you know, I think there's a tendency to say, hey, we're going to do a big project and we're going to fix everything. And I think thinking of it as a continuum as you go into the future is really important to keep in mind.
Makes sense. Juanita, what's your perspective on this?
Let me just speak to what I heard was, how do you gather the data you need to assess these risks? So in the demand side, for example, how do I understand what the potential impacts of increasing temperature are on my system in terms of just increased energy loads, but also changing load profiles as increased saturation of air conditioning, for example, moves, and as potentially systems move to more electrification? The thoughts of that are frightening, right? How peaks are going to shift and how load factors are going to shift. So, you know, it is tough. We've done this analysis in the US where we've looked at the potential impact. We did a study for EPA several years ago and are updating one now, but how do you look at demand impacts? And we're rich in data here. You know, we have tons of data on, you know, cooling and heating degree days and fairly detailed load curves and whatnot. And so we were able to do that. And there's even studies on sensitivity of air conditioning saturation to temperature. And, you know, you can even do some cross-sectional analysis of how it varies across the country. But that's tough in some countries to get that kind of data. But the methods are there. It's, can you begin to develop that data? And then the other piece we've looked at is, how do power plants perform under increasing temperatures? You know, what if, you know, Colorado becomes Texas? What happens to the power plants there in terms of their net dependable capacity and their efficiencies? And we did, again, the same study for EPA many years ago where it was horrific. Just looking at the data of what the D-rate was across the country by temperature, and then trying to shift those scales to other parts of the country. This update, we now are using an engineering software that lets you look at how does a plant's output change given changes in temperature and humidity and altitude and so on. So it's more of an engineering base. So there's a way to do that. Those impacts are small compared to hydro and demand, but if you want to look across the system, that's one of the approaches we've used, where you're just trying to get unit level sort of assessment of impacts. Hydro, I think, is, you know, that's tough. We've done econometric approaches there where you don't have this rich WEEP kind of modeling. That's not something every country is going to be able to tackle, but perhaps some simpler econometric approaches to try to look at how water flow has varied over time, and, you know, and hydro generation related to that. So I don't know, those are some of the things we've looked at, just trying to get our arms around how you quantify these impacts over time.
Yeah, good approaches, but I guess for all of us, it's kind of on the cutting edge, right? Like we're figuring this out as we go.
Yeah.
That's how it goes when you're doing important work. Not seeing too many more questions, and we are losing a few people. So let me turn it over to James so he can give that final survey. James.
All right. Yes. Thank you. I'll post a link to this survey in the chat. It's just kind of a feedback survey based on the webinar. And please do take the time to fill this out. I think it's a 3-minute survey, so it's just a couple questions, and it's questions and information that our sponsors for the webinar really like. And the more higher response rate we get on these, the more likely we are going to be able to do more of these in the future. So I posted the link there. It's a SurveyMonkey link in the chat. So please just you can click on that and head over there and fill out the 10 quick questions that are in that survey.
All right. Thanks a lot for that, James. No, sorry, go ahead.
Otherwise, I was just going to say thank you to thank you to everyone, to all the presenters and to all the attendees, to USAID, ICF, and CCREEE too.
Well, we are very grateful for you all to come and share your perspectives. NREL, you all are old friends, and you all have been great. And ICF, Juanita, thanks a lot for bringing a lot of real experience to this. It was really invaluable, really interesting to hear what it's like for someone else who's gone through this process. We're trying to do it here as well in the Caribbean, and as to quote you, it's tough sometimes, but we're well, making progress, I think. Thank you for coming. Yep. And thank you for the faithful few who stayed with us to the end. Please fill out the survey. We want to make these engagements as useful for you as possible, and we will continue to have them as we go. This was a very useful session, and I think we're going to try and post the video to this online, so that those people who weren't able to make it with us live today will be able to access it through other means. Once again, this is Gerald Lindo speaking to you from the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. This has been our IRRP Capacity Building Series. Thank you to NREL, thank you to ICF, thank you to USAID who made this possible. Thank you to GIZ as well, who sponsored us overall. And thank you, everyone who attended, for making this event what it was. That's it for now. We will speak to you again soon. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye now.
Bye-bye.